In 1844, Ranger Captain Jack Hayes rode into Comanche country with 15 men and almost no food. What kept them alive was a pouch of parched corn mixed with sugar, cold flour, number 25 on this list. Most people picture Texas Rangers as gunfighters who never stop to eat. The truth is stranger. Number 14 was so hard men joked it could stop a bullet. Number 3 came straight from the Mexican vaqueros the Rangers rode beside and chased down. These 25 meals fueled the toughest lawmen the frontier ever made. Hit that subscribe button and let's count down what Texas Rangers actually ate hunting outlaws across the Wild West. Number 25, cold flour. When a ranger company left the settlements to chase raiders deep into the brush, it could not carry a wagon, a cook, or a fire that might give away its position. So it carried cold flour. Rangers took dried corn, parched it hard in the coals until it browned, then ground it fine and stirred in a little brown sugar and sometimes a scrape of cinnamon. A man could pour 2 spoonfuls into a cup of creek water, stir, and drink his supper in the saddle without ever striking a match. Dry, it packed into a small buckskin pouch and rode behind the cantle for weeks without spoiling. Jack Hayes's men lived on it for days at a stretch during the raids of the 1840s. It tasted like sweet toasted meal and grit, but a few ounces carried a man through a full day's ride when stopping to build a fire meant getting killed. The Mexican vaqueros called their version pinole. The Rangers just called it what kept them alive. Number 24, jerked beef. Long before jerky came in shiny bags at a gas station, it was the difference between a ranger eating and a ranger starving. When a company killed a stray beef or a wild longhorn, the meat that could not be eaten that night was cut into thin strips, rubbed hard with salt, and hung over mesquite smoke or draped on brush to dry in the Texas sun. In that dry heat, it cured fast, turning dark and stiff as leather. Properly made, it lasted months in a saddlebag without a hint of spoiling. A man chewed it slow while he rode, working a single strip for an hour to pull every bit of flavor and salt out of it. The Mexicans called it carne seca and often pounded it fine with a little fat and chili to stretch it further. A few strips could carry a ranger through a day when there was no time to hunt and no time to cook. It asked nothing of a man but strong teeth and patience. Number 23, Sowbelly and Frijoles. This was the meal that fed the Rangers the way it fed every man who worked the Texas frontier. Sowbelly, cured, salted pork belly packed in barrels, traveled for months without spoiling, and a slab of it rode in the pack of nearly every company that could afford it. The cook sliced it thick, fried it in a skillet or a Dutch oven until the fat rendered and the edges crisped, then dropped a pot of pinto beans into the same grease to soak up every drop. A pound of salt pork cost around 10 or 12 cents at a frontier trading post, and beans came in big sacks, measured out careful across a long scout. The whole thing was salty, greasy, and the same night after night, but it delivered the fat and protein that hard riding demanded. Men ate with tin plates balanced on their knees, mopping the bean liquor with whatever bread they had. On the frontier, Sowbelly and Frijoles was not a meal you looked forward to. It was a meal you counted on. Number 22, pan de campo. Along the Rio Grande, where Anglo Rangers and Mexican vaqueros shared the same fires and the same enemies, camp bread came out of the Dutch oven every day it possibly could. Pan de campo was nothing more than flour, lard, a little baking powder, salt, and water, worked into a rough dough with the fingers and no rising time at all. The cook pressed it flat, dropped it into a greased Dutch oven, buried the lid in coals, and 20 minutes later pulled out a golden round the size of a wagon wheel, chewy in the middle and charred at the edges. Torn into chunks, it scooped beans, sopped gravy, and wrapped around a strip of fried meat. It needed no kneading, no oven, and no special skill. Just fire and a heavy iron pot. Tejano cooks passed the technique to the Rangers, and the Rangers carried it across the whole state. Today, Texas calls pan de campo its official state bread. Back then, it was just how you made bread when your kitchen was a saddlebag. Number 21. Sourdough biscuits. The most valuable thing in any long-riding outfit was not the coffee or the beans. It was the sourdough starter. A cook guarded his crock of fermented flour and water like scripture, keeping it warm against his own body on cold nights so the wild yeast would not die. Each morning he pinched off a portion, worked in flour, lard, and a little soda, and baked the biscuits in a Dutch oven sunk in coals. What came out was tangy, flaky, and far better than anything commercial yeast could make. A good cook could turn out 3 or 4 dozen before sunup for a hungry company. Men split them and drowned them in gravy, smeared them with molasses, or stuffed extras in a coat pocket for the long hours in the saddle. When a starter froze or spoiled on the trail, it was a genuine crisis, and a good one might travel hundreds of miles across a season, handed from cook to cook like a living heirloom. Number 20. Prickly pear and nopalitos. In the dry country west of the Nueces, where a company might ride a full day without finding a creek, the Rangers learned from the vaqueros to eat the desert itself. The prickly pear cactus grew thick across the brush, and its flat green pads, nopales, could be held over a fire to burn off the spines, then peeled and sliced into strips. Fried in a little grease with onion and chili, they came out tender and faintly tart, somewhere between a green bean and an okra pod. In summer, the plant threw out its fruit, the deep red tunas, sweet and sticky and full of water when a canteen ran low. A man learned quick to singe off the tiny hairs before he took a bite, or he spent the next day picking them out of his tongue. It was not much of a meal, but in a land that seemed built to kill a man, the cactus gave up food and water both, and the Rangers took what the country offered. Number 19. Mesquite beans. The mesquite tree was a curse to a rider, thorny, tangled, and everywhere. But come late summer, it hung heavy with long yellow pods, and those pods were food. The Rangers, again learning from the Tejanos and the tribes before them, gathered the ripe pods and ground them into a sweet, pale meal. Chewed raw, the pods tasted like a faint, grainy candy, sweet enough that a hungry man could work through a handful just for the sugar. Ground and mixed with water, the meal made a rough porridge or a flat cake baked on a hot rock. In a hard season, when the flour ran out and the beans ran low, mesquite meal filled the gap and put a little energy back in a worn-out man. The horses ate the pods too, which meant a stand of mesquite could feed both a ranger and his mount in a country where nothing else would. What most men cursed as brush, the smart ones saw as a pantry. Here is where the truth about the Rangers gets interesting. The cattle drives had chuck wagons, rolling kitchens with a cook, a Dutch oven, and a box full of comforts. The Rangers almost never did. When a company was hunting a killer or chasing raiders across the border, speed was everything, and a wagon slowed a man down and gave him away. So the Rangers ate out of their saddlebags. A pouch of cold flour, a slab of jerky, a twist of coffee, a little salt. That was the whole kitchen, and it rode behind the saddle. They ate cold more often than hot, on the move more often than in camp, crouched over a hatful of fire that would not throw light for a raider to see. A ranger did not eat to enjoy his food. He ate to keep riding. And the man who could go furthest on the least was the man who came home. Number 18. Venison backstrap. When a company had a day of rest and a rifle, the country fed them well. White-tailed deer were thick across the hill country and the brush, and a good shot meant fresh meat for the whole outfit. The prize was the backstrap, the long, tender muscle running down the spine. which a cook cut into thick medallions and seared fast over open coals until the outside charred and the inside stayed rosy and juicy. Cooked too long, venison turned dry and livery, so the men who knew it best pulled it off the fire early. There was no better meal on the frontier than fresh backstrap, salt, and a mesquite fire under a Texas sky. The rest of the deer went nowhere to waste. The hams jerked for later, the ribs roasted, the liver fried up that same night while it was still fresh. A single deer could carry a small company for days, and it cost nothing but a cartridge and a steady hand. Number 17, wild turkey. Along the river bottoms and the oak flats, wild turkeys roosted by the hundreds, and a ranger who could drop one at dusk brought real meat to the fire. These were not the soft, fat birds of a modern table. A wild tom was lean, tough, and dark, its meat tasting of the acorns and seeds it lived on. The cook plucked and gutted it, then either roasted it slow on a spit turned by hand, or cut it up and simmered it for hours in a pot until the stringy meat gave up and fell apart into a rich broth, turned into a stew with a little cornmeal or a few beans. One big tom stretched across a whole company. The men who wrote down their memories years later remembered those birds fondly. A break from salt pork, a taste of something fresh, and a full belly on a night when the country had been generous. On the frontier, a fat turkey was as good as money. Number 16, jackrabbit stew. When the deer and turkey were scarce, there was always the jackrabbit, and the brush country was crawling with them. A jackrabbit was lean, gamey, and tough as a boot if a man just threw it on a fire, so the rangers learned to cook it the only way it was fit to eat, low and slow in a pot. Skinned and cut into pieces, it went into a Dutch oven with water, a little salt pork for fat, an onion if there was one, and whatever wild chilies or herbs the country offered. 2 or 3 hours later, the meat had softened enough to pull from the bone, and the broth had turned savory and thick. It was not a rich meal, but it was hot, and it was fresh, and it filled the plates when nothing bigger had shown itself. Cottontails cooked up sweeter and quicker when a man could get them, but the big jacks were what the dry country handed you, and a hungry ranger did not turn one down. Number 15, chili con carne. Long before it became a stadium food, chili was born on the streets and camps of Texas, and the rangers ate it the way it was really made, mostly meat, no beans mixed in. Tough beef or venison was cut small and stewed for hours with dried red chilies, wild garlic, onion, and cumin until the peppers melted into a dark, fiery gravy and the meat turned tender. The heat did more than flavor it. In the days before refrigeration, the chilies helped preserve the meat and covered up the taste of anything starting to turn. The dish traced its roots to San Antonio, where the famous chili queens sold bowls of it from open-air stands in the plaza by lamplight. Rangers passing through carried the taste back to their camps across the state, and a pot of chili simmering over a mesquite fire could feed men in shifts as they rode in off watch. It was cheap, it was hot, and it stuck to a man's ribs through a cold night. Number 14, sheet iron crackers. Here is the one so hard men swore it could stop a bullet. Hardtack, dense squares of flour and water baked until every drop of moisture was gone, was the ration that outlasted everything else. It survived years in a pack without spoiling, which made it perfect for a company that might not see a supply point for months. The trouble was eating it. Men called it sheet iron, tooth duller, and worse, because a fresh cracker could crack a tooth clean in half. So the rangers soaked it, dropped it in coffee until it went soft, or crumbled it into bacon grease and fried it up into a rough hash. Dry, it was nearly inedible. Softened, it was survival. A single cracker carried enough calories to keep a man moving, and when the fresh meat ran out and the flour was gone, sheet iron crackers were often the only thing standing between a ranger and an empty stomach. Nobody liked it. Everybody carried it. Here is what modern nutrition has since confirmed about the way these men ate. When a ranger killed a deer or a beef, he did not eat only the choice cuts and ride off. He ate the liver, the heart, the kidneys, the marrow, everything the animal offered. That instinct was not just about not wasting food, though on the frontier waste could get a man killed. It was biologically sound. Organ meats carried concentrated doses of iron, vitamin A, B12, and zinc, exactly the nutrients that kept men strong through brutal work and long deprivation. The Mexican vaqueros the rangers rode with had eaten this way for generations, and the tribes before them for centuries. Nobody had a laboratory or a chart. They just knew, bone deep, that the men who ate the whole animal rode harder and lasted longer than the men who did not. The knowledge came from survival, and survival does not lie. Number 13, son of a bitch stew. When a beef was slaughtered fresh, the best eating was not the steak. It was the stew made from everything else. Son of a bitch stew, known around the fire by a far saltier name, used every part of a young calf. The heart, liver, sweetbreads, tongue, and the marrow gut, the tube between the two stomachs that carried a rich, creamy quality no other ingredient could match. The cook simmered it all for hours with onion, chili, and whatever else the camp had until it thickened into something deep and savory. Eastern visitors who saw it made recoiled, but the rangers knew better. This was a feast, cooked only when fresh beef came available, and it delivered the concentrated nourishment that beans and jerky simply could not. It wasted nothing, honored the animal, and put real strength back into worn men. A cook who could make a good son of a bitch stew was worth his weight to a company, and every man in it knew it. Number 12, rattlesnake. The country was thick with rattlesnakes, and a ranger who killed one for his own safety learned there was no reason to leave good meat lying in the dust. Skinned and gutted, the long white body was cut into sections, dredged in a little cornmeal or flour, and fried in hot grease until golden. The meat was pale, mild, and surprisingly good, closer to fish or frog than anyone expected, with a fine, delicate texture that took well to salt and chili. The only trouble was the ribs, a maze of small bones a man had to work around careful. It was never a meal a company set out to make, but when the hunting was poor and a fat diamondback crossed the trail, a hungry ranger did not walk past free protein just because it had a rattle on its tail. The men who tried it once were often surprised, and the ones who scoffed usually kept their opinions until they had gone a day or two without eating. Number 11, Cabrito. Down along the border, where Mexican and Anglo cooking blended into something all its own, the finest meal a company could hope for was Cabrito, young roasted goat. Kid goats were cheap and plentiful in the ranch country of South Texas, and when the rangers camped near a settlement or a friendly rancho, a whole cabrito might go over the coals. Split and staked out near a low mesquite fire, it roasted slow for hours, the fat rendering and the skin crisping while the meat stayed tender and sweet. Pulled apart and wrapped in a warm tortilla with a little salt and chili, it was as good as anything a man could eat on the frontier. This was celebration food, the kind of meal that marked the end of a hard scout or a friendly welcome from a border town. The Tejano families made it best, passing the technique down for generations, and a ranger lucky enough to sit at that fire ate like a king for a night. Number 10, Kush. When the meat ran out and the meal sack was getting light, there was always Kush, the poor company's standby. The cook took cold cornbread or plain cornmeal, crumbled it into a skillet with a little bacon grease and water, and fried and stirred it until it browned into a soft, savory hash. Some cooks poured in a little coffee or leftover gravy to loosen it and deepen the flavor. It was heavy, filling, and about as plain as food gets, but it sat in a man's stomach and burned slow through a long day. Kush was what appeared when everything better had failed. The floor of frontier cooking. The meal that meant supplies were low, but nobody was going to bed hungry. A man did not brag about eating Kush, but he was grateful for it more nights than he liked to admit. And a skillet of it split among tired rangers was the difference between riding on and giving out. Number 9. Fried river catfish. When a company made camp along the Brazos, the Guadalupe, or the Colorado, supper often came out of the water. The Texas rivers ran thick with catfish, and a few set lines left overnight could pull in enough to feed the whole outfit by morning. The cook cleaned them, rolled the fillets in cornmeal and salt, and fried them in hot grease until the crust turned deep gold and crackling. Fresh catfish, still tasting of the river, was one of the great pleasures of the trail. Flaky, rich, and a welcome change from salt pork and beans. A camp beside good water meant more than a drink and a wash. It meant fresh fish and full plates, and the men who rode the river country ate better for it. The rangers learned the fishing holes the way they learned the water crossings and the outlaw trails, by riding the same ground until every bend of the river gave up its secrets. Number 8. Redeye gravy and fried salt pork. When a cook took pity on his men after a hard night, breakfast might rise above the usual monotony. Thick slices of cured salt pork were fried until the edges curled and browned and the fat popped in the pan. Then, while the skillet still sizzled, the cook poured in black coffee, scraping up every bit of browned crust stuck to the iron. The liquid bubbled down into a thin, reddish gravy, redeye, with a bite that cut clean through the heavy salt of the pork. Men sopped it up with pan de campo, or a cold biscuit, chasing every drop across a tin plate. It used nothing the camp did not already have: pork, coffee, and a hot pan. But on a cold, gray morning after a long ride, that little bit of extra effort felt like generosity, and a good breakfast could carry a company's spirits through a bad day. Here is something the movies never show. The Rangers ran on coffee, sometimes close to a gallon of it a man across a hard day. On the frontier, one brand ruled: Arbuckle's Ariosa, sold in a distinctive package and so common that Arbuckle's became the word for coffee itself. The beans came roasted and glazed with an egg and sugar coating that sealed in the flavor, and inside every package was a peppermint stick. The man who agreed to grind the beans got to keep the candy, so there was never a shortage of volunteers, even after a brutal day in the saddle. Coffee was not a luxury to a ranger. It was medicine, warmth, and ritual all at once. The first pot went on before dawn, and the last stayed warm until the night watch rode out. Strong, black, and bitter enough to stand a spoon in, it was the one comfort a man could count on when everything else had gone wrong. Number 7. Tamales. Along the Rio Grande, the Rangers ate tamales the way the Tejano families made them: corn masa spread on a soaked husk, filled with spiced shredded meat, folded and steamed until firm. What made tamales perfect for the trail was that they traveled. A cook or a border family could make a whole batch at once, and they kept for days, easy to carry and easy to heat over a small fire, or eat cold in the saddle when there was no time to stop. Unwrapped from the husk, a tamale was a complete meal in the hand, soft, savory, and warming, with the chili and meat wrapped tight inside a shell of corn. For an Anglo Ranger raised on cornbread and beans, the first tamale was a revelation, and it did not take long before a company welcomed a bundle of them as gladly as a side of bacon. It was frontier fast food, made by the same border families the Rangers so often depended on. Number 6. Stewed dried apples. Fresh fruit was nearly impossible to keep on a long scout, but dried apples traveled in a sack for weeks without trouble, and when a cook wanted to lift the men's spirits, he reached for them. Simmered in water with a little sugar and a shake of cinnamon, those leathery rings plumped back up into something soft, sweet, and almost like fresh fruit again. The smell alone changed the mood of a camp. Men who had eaten nothing but meat and beans for weeks closed their eyes over that first spoonful, remembering orchards and home in the settlements they had left behind. Dried apples cost a few cents a pound at a frontier store, cheap enough that even a lean company could budget for a sack. Stewed apples came at the end of a meal, a small sweetness to send men off to their bedrolls a little more content than they had been. On the frontier, even a bite of sugar was a kind of mercy. Number 5. Wild honey. The Texas country was full of bee trees, and a ranger who found one and was willing to brave the stings to rob it brought back the rarest treat on the frontier: pure wild honey. Sweetness was scarce and precious out in the brush, and a comb of honey was as good as striking gold. The men drizzled it over cold biscuits and pan de campo, stirred it into coffee, and ate chunks of the comb straight, wax and all. It was quick energy in a country that offered little, and a taste of something wonderful in a life of salt and grit. Finding a bee tree was cause for a small celebration, and a company that stumbled onto one ate well that night. The honey never lasted long. Nothing sweet ever did in a camp full of hungry men, but for a day or two it turned plain trail food into something a ranger actually looked forward to. Number 4. Corn dodgers. When the flour ran out and the cornmeal was all that was left, the rangers made corn dodgers, dense little cakes of cornmeal, salt and water, shaped by hand and fried in grease or baked on a hot rock by the fire. They came out heavy, golden, and filling enough to anchor a meal when nothing else was on hand. The texture was gritty and the flavor plain, but a dodger soaked up bean liquor and gravy like nothing else, and a man could stuff a couple in his pocket to gnaw on cold through the long hours in the saddle. Cornmeal cost about half what flour did on the frontier, which made corn dodgers the bread of a lean company far from any store. Some cooks worked in a little bacon or a spoonful of honey when they could. Small luxuries, a man remembered. Plain or dressed up, corn dodgers were the reliable, hard-riding bread that never let a ranger down. Number 3. Flour tortillas. Here is the food that came straight from the vaqueros the rangers rode beside and chased across the border. The flour tortilla was a South Texas creation made from flour, lard, salt, and water, rolled thin and cooked fast on a hot iron until it puffed and blistered. Warm and pliable, it did everything a ranger needed a bread to do. It wrapped around a strip of fried meat, scooped up beans, held a spoonful of chili, or rolled up with a little honey for something sweet. It cooked in minutes, needed no oven, and stayed soft enough to fold cold hours later. The Tejano cooks made them by the dozen, and the rangers came to prize them as much as any bread on the frontier. More than that, the tortilla was a reminder of a truth the movies flatten. The Texas frontier was a blend of peoples, and the food that fed the rangers came as much from the Mexican families of the border as from anywhere back east. Every warm tortilla carried that history in it. Number 2. Frijoles refritos. A pot of pinto beans could feed a company once, but a good cook made them stretch by turning the leftovers into frijoles refritos, beans fried again. Cold cooked beans went into a skillet with hot lard or bacon grease, mashed down with the back of a spoon, and fried until they thickened into a rich, savory paste. What had been plain beans the night before became something better the second day, deeper, fattier, and easy to scoop with a tortilla or spread on pan de campo. Nothing went to waste, and a pot of beans that might have fed a company for one meal fed them for 2 or 3. The vaqueros made them best, and the rangers learned the trick and never let it go. On the frontier, the ability to turn leftovers into a whole new meal was not a fancy kitchen skill. It was survival, and the cook who mastered it was the man who kept his company fed when the supplies ran thin. Number 1, coffee and beans. In the end, the meal that truly fueled the Texas Rangers was not a stew or a roast or anything a man would put on a menu. It was coffee and beans, day after day, year after year, eaten hot in camp when there was time and cold in the saddle when there was not. Beans in the belly and arbuckles in the cup. That was the real ration of the frontier. The 2 things that never left the pack. And beans carried a weight in ranger country that ran deeper than food. In 1843, after the Muir expedition failed and the Texan prisoners were forced to draw lots, a black bean meant a firing squad and a white bean meant your life. Every man who ate frijoles by a ranger fire knew that story. It hung over the plate. So when a ranger scooped cold beans from a pot before a hard ride, he was eating the plainest food on the frontier and the most loaded with meaning, survival, luck, and the thin line between coming home and not. That was the ranger's real meal. Not glory, not steak under the stars, just coffee, beans, and the will to ride one more day. Here is the challenge. Make one of these this week: the frijoles refritos, the chili con carne, the cold flour your great-great-grandfather might have carried. Then come back and tell me if it was as rough as you thought, because I made the pan de campo, and I get why they baked it every single day. Drop the one you are going to try in the comments. And if your family ever rode with the Rangers or worked the border country, tell me what stories survived, because these were not just meals. They were how the hardest men the frontier ever made stayed alive.